Welcome to the Barrel Age Faith. I have an awesome guest today, Derek Cummins. We've connected. Oh man, it's several months ago down at Steubenville at the Sola Scriptura debate
Yeah, man.
conference, and it was fun to connect with you there. Derek runs a really awesome YouTube channel. He's on Locals called the Dose of Theosis. So during this interview, got to subscribe to his channel. You've got to definitely find him on Locals, support him. He's always pushing out tons of awesome like articles and videos, and I love following all of his content on there. And so just so happy to have you on the Barrel Age Faith today, Derek. How you doing?
Great, man. I really appreciate you doing this, and you plug my channel better than I do. So, big thanks to that. And also, the content's awesome because you've helped create some of it. So, thank you for doing that.
Thanks for the invite. Just a little touch, and we got to do some collaboration where I wrote a few articles on fasting. So you made me think really hard about the history of fasting. It was a lot of fun. And then you're also connected to Exodus 90, which is
Yeah,
cool.
I work
Yeah.
for Exodus, so I'm the digital marketing manager there. So I do a lot of our content marketing and email, push notifications, YouTube channel, social media, all that stuff.
Yeah, so definitely, if you don't know what Exodus 90 is, or you know it a little bit, you got to check it out. It's going to do awesome things for your faith. It's so important for all Christians, whether you're Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant, to find a way to, plug in with the ascetical tradition, the fasting tradition, purging and purifying, letting go of that which holds us back from fully loving Christ. That's what the Barrel Age Faith is all about. So let's go ahead and I want to hear why you chose Dose of Theosis for your channel name, for your ministry. What does theosis mean?
Yeah, so theosis is like the theological distinctive of the Eastern Christian tradition. This idea of becoming what God is through his grace. So we become what he is by nature through grace, and being transformed from one degree of glory to another in the likeness and image of God, a real ontological change in who you are, and participating in the transfigured life, participating in the resurrection life, the ascended life, all these things. So I was really fascinated by that, like this idea that I could actually participate in who God is, by his grace. And I thought, what can I do to help people find that? And how can I help people get a little dose of that every day? So trying to create content that is specific to unity within the church, but also edifying and just pointing people always back to Christ, and putting their lives into him, into his life, plugging into that stream of grace. So
Mm,
hopefully every little thing we do on the channel is a dose of that.
yeah, it's awesome, and it's pretty ecumenical. I mean, your channel, it's throwing out all sorts of resources from church history, not just like exclusively East or West.
Yeah, and it's weird. It started when I was doing live streams on another channel, and that audience was like, "Hey, you should start your own thing." So I started it, and like a swath of them migrated over to my page. And so my audience, I mean, I'm Eastern Orthodox, and almost 100% of my audience is Roman Catholic. But they're very interested in lovingly wanting to learn about the Eastern tradition, and we've explored the Oriental Orthodox tradition quite a bit. And there's just a lot of good ideas flowing around, but primarily there's a lot of good, like, hey, I need prayer. Can you pray for me? Let me offer prayers. Let me offer words of encouragement. We've mourned together. We've cried together. We've laughed together. We've celebrated together. It's been a really beautiful community.
Yeah, that's awesome. And it sounds like it's kind of a way for you to express like your journey of even kind of, pastoral care, like being able to take care of people, hear their prayer requests, and journey
Yeah.
along together in a community. Because you were a Protestant pastor in a charismatic tradition. Is that your story? Or were you like a youth minister or
Yeah. Youth associate pastor. So that covers, as many things as it needs to, but primarily youth ministry, young adults ministry. I was in charge of our missions department for a while. I was part of the worship team. I was part of a lot of different things. But
yeah,
yeah.
so we're going to be covering your journey today, like your journey from Protestantism, particularly the charismatic tradition, and then into Eastern Orthodoxy and some of the big questions that you faced when you were doing that. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say. A lot of people may know you too because you were on Pints with Aquinas which is just always growing like month by month, year by year. And that's where I first like discovered you. I was watching your interview. I'm like, this guy, man, when I was watching your interview, I was like just thinking about myself going through the whole exact journey, 10 years before. And I felt like I was right there with you in the room. And it was fun running into you at Steubenville after watching that interview and seeing like, picking up where that interview left off to see where you were in your faith. Yeah. But what was that like, by the way, like being on Pints with Aquinas with Matt and you guys still are kind of like friends, right? You guys talk?
Yeah. Yeah. We're really good friends. So I had connected with him originally because I had seen an interview he did with Father Michael O'Loughlin. And that was like my first introduction to just the concept of Eastern Catholicism in general. And I was really interested in what he had to say. So I have this habit of like, if there's a person that I want to talk to, I'm going to find a way to connect with them. And I'm just going to reach out to them. I'm going to send a thoughtful message. And I always include a GIF or an image of Michael Scott that says like, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, Wayne Gretzky, Michael Scott. And that's like the secret weapon, man. Like that always gets a response. So I reached out to Matt and I was like, hey, I know you had this priest on your channel. Like I just left my position as a youth pastor. I'm kind of floundering around. I'm on the path to become Eastern Orthodox, but now I see this thing is here and that warrants some discussion and some unpacking. Like, do you think you could speak to this? And my email had my phone number in it and he just texted me and we started talking. And then he's like, I'm moving to Steubenville. I was like, that's my backyard basically, because I'm just near Pittsburgh. Mm-hmm. And a few more circumstances happened. We developed a friendship. And eventually he was like, hey, you should come on the show and talk to people about how this isn't what the internet makes it seem to be. This isn't some like clear cut, like drag out one wins over the other, Catholicism over Orthodoxy, and like talk about what it's like to struggle with it and not know and not be certain, and like the way that affects your family and the way that affects just your life. And so I went on and did it.
I dove very deeply into Orthodoxy, as deep as you can in a number of years. I mean, it's infinitely deep, but I never took the time to kind of examine some of these theological things in Catholicism that I didn't believe. I just didn't believe them, And I have found that it's, at least to the best of my understanding, which is flawed, that things are far closer than I thought they were in a lot of things. So, Immaculate Conception, the view of the Theotokos as Panagia in Orthodoxy. And there is an idea of primacy in the first millennium. It's just, where did that overstep? And, taking St. Paul seriously, where he says, if you depart from the tradition, then you shouldn't go to the table together. And that's why there's a break in at least ecclesial communion. And or even, purgatory and aerial toll houses. Yeah. And they're very different, but you see that there's at least some idea that, death is purgatorial. So it's just like, there's something to work with there, if we can talk about it, I guess. Yeah.
So I went on and did it. And I got a lot of blowback for it, actually.
Oh, you did?
I did. There was a lot of my Orthodox friends were very unhappy that I wasn't like as certain as they were. And this was like a month before my chrismation, mind you, that I did this. And a lot of Catholics were like, why is he wandering around back and forth? Obviously he's wrong. Like nobody wants to hear this. So it was nice to not fit in anybody's camp at that point.
Right. They were wanting you to like go in there and just like with the pitchfork and right. Take it out. Yeah. And that's kind of the difficult challenge of like being ecumenical, like taking, John 17 so seriously, that the Lord wants his church to be one and unified. And that can be heart-wrenching at times when it feels like tribalism is kind of on the rise.
Yeah. And I've repeatedly said this a lot. Like, it doesn't do me any good to sit around in a group of people and talk about how right we are when it's at the expense of like fulfilling the things in Matthew 25. I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. And like, yeah, all head and no heart, or all head and no hands. And it's.
Yeah. And I think this is where, I look at somebody like Father David Abernathy, an Eastern Catholic priest who like is just bringing the Desert Fathers to the forefront for so many people, particularly Catholics, And he was one that played a big role in like introducing me to the Desert Fathers in a much deeper way. And it's a beautiful place to be because the Desert Fathers unite many of our the apostolic churches, whether that be Coptic Oriental Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox or Catholic. It's like a fountain that unites us. But what's cool about them is that they want us to embrace the virtuous life.
Yeah.
And when you look at apologetics sometimes online, it doesn't look like that.
Right.
So we've got some work cut out for us.
For sure. I need to meet Father David. He's in Pittsburgh and like should be easily accessible to be able to meet up with and talk to sometimes. So I need to talk to him.
Yeah, he's gold, man. He's gold. He's always throwing out some great little videos and articles and classes. So Philokalia Ministries, I think, is what his ministry is called. So definitely check that out too during this interview. All right, let's talk about your journey. That's what people have been waiting on anyways. Did you grow up in a Christian tradition, or did you, some people, they don't even have faith background, or it's kind of nominal. What's your story?
I would definitely say it was nominal. We were loosely Christian. The more that I like reflect on my childhood and the more that I feel like I recognize more of the way it really was. So my grandparents were members of the Church of the Nazarene. So like a very just conservative denomination of Christianity, but it was a very small church in a very small town. So there was like 10 people in the church and they were all of retirement age. So anytime I did go, I was the only child, and it was, give me some cookies and some crayons, like just keep quiet and get through this thing. If you want, you can go downstairs. There was like a creepy toy room with like really old toys and smelly green carpet. But for some reason, like they always fasted from meat on Fridays during Lent. And like my grandfather had a very beautiful, simple faith. He loved the Bible. He loved hymns. He loved to sing, and he was very generous. Like when he died, and I actually had the honor of officiating his funeral and giving the eulogy. As I was kind of gathering stories, I probably heard from 5 or 6 different people that like, hey, I was down on my luck, and I lived with them for a while, and like I never paid for anything. He never asked for anything, or he was just super generous. So that was like the string of faith in my life. My parents split, things were tumultuous. It was actually a pretty rocky childhood, I suppose, but there wasn't a lot of faith components aside from that. But the rest of my family had a lot of like new age influence coming in. So I saw a lot of like, in my cousin's tarot cards would fly around. Like my mom would go to fortune tellers and like things like that. So a very loose Christianity that I eventually abandoned, like in my teenage years, when I was doing the whole sex, drugs, and rock and roll thing.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Yeah. St. Augustine kind of running away stage. And then was there a moment, a person, an encounter with Christ that just kind of swept you away, or maybe a series of stages that took you into the life of the church?
I ended up going to a Christian university, Waynesburg University, in Pennsylvania. And my first year there, I just kind of continued on the path that I was on. And honestly, I didn't even want to go to that school in the first place. I wanted to go to Duquesne University for their music program, and I'm a drummer, but I had broken my wrist, so I couldn't audition for the music program. So it was like either wait until next year or just go somewhere else. So I ended up going to Waynesburg, and like I said, just kind of continued on, got in with the same kind of friends that I was always hanging out with, getting drunk, getting high, that whole bit. And
when you said rock and roll, you literally meant it a second ago. Like,
oh yeah, yeah,
like you were actually in a band and you were a drummer. And
yeah, well, I was the screaming vocalist in a heavy metal band.
Okay. Cool.
Which that actually plays into the story in a little bit.
I know a lot of like heavy, like Orthodox guys who were in heavy metal bands. This must be some kind of like trending thing.
The aesthetic lends itself. Like, I don't know. Do you know like the Death to the World?
Yeah. There's like this Death to the World gothic like feel. A
lot of skulls, a lot of, but anyway, my freshman year of college, all of my friends dropped out, like all of them. and I had no friends. So my advisor was like, why don't you hang out with these guys from the music program? Like, at least you'll have that in common. And then they started inviting me to chapel and then like Bible studies. It didn't really sink in. But between my junior and senior year of college, my band went on tour, and we had just this lousy van that kept breaking down, and we got in some dangerous areas of town, and like people were like, you got to get out of here before sunset or you're done. And we were really scared, you know, and the only thing I could think to do was like what my grandfather would teach me to do is like, if you're scared, you can pray. And it was very simple prayers, like, you know, God, just if you're there, like, can you just make the van start? And repeatedly, when the mechanic would say like, hey, the fuel pump's toast on this, it's not going to turn on, like the van is not going to start, it would fire up and we'd make it to the next town and then we'd do it again. And so at a certain point I was like, okay, there's something to this warrants a little more investigation. And we came back from the tour. I told the band I wanted to be a Christian band. I didn't know what that meant, I didn't know how or what we were going to do, but I just felt like God did something for us, we need to do something in return. And they were not interested in that, so I had quit the band like immediately. And then I moved to Nashville, Tennessee, and that kind of brings to the next leg of the journey. But
Wow, so you go to the heart of contemporary Christian music, the capital, Nashville.
yeah,
Is that why you went there?
not at all. I
Oh,
mean,
okay.
I went because I wanted to work in recording studios.
Yeah,
So
it's
I
the
do.
obviously, yeah.
But I mean, when you go from Pittsburgh being like a decent sized fish in a puddle to a minnow in an ocean, it was just too cutthroat.
Right, right.
And I initially, I mean, I started going to church when I was there. You know, we went to this really great evangelical church called the Village Chapel. And it was just beautiful. And the pastor there, Pastor Jim, you know, expository preaching and like had a love for the fathers, would always reference the fathers a lot. Um, for being a church where, you know, the violin players from Mumford and Sons and like the dude from Reliant K is playing guitar in the corner in the worship band, they would keep the band behind a curtain in a corner to make sure that they weren't like the thing. And so we had great experiences there. But I was going to school at MTSU for recording technology. And the problem was my schedule. I was working in one area of town, which was half an hour from where I lived, which was 45 minutes from where I was going to school. And I'd have recording sessions at like 1 a.m.
Mm-hmm.
So I was a lot of nights of like sleeping in my car so I could get up for work at 4 and like be ready to do all this. It just became unsustainable. So I dropped out of my graduate program and I had no idea what to do. But I knew that I had like this deep, insatiable hunger to study theology and like study scripture and try to make sense of this new thing that I had found. Like, what's right? Like, I wanted to know what's true. And for whatever reason, the best way I could figure to do that at the time was to enroll in seminary. So I went to Lipscomb University, which is affiliated with the Church of Christ,
Oh, okay.
Restorationist movement.
Yeah.
And that's where I did my master's in theology.
The Restorationist movement kind of started in like the 1800s.
Yeah.
And it's interesting movement. We don't have to talk about it in depth, but a lot of people don't know much about it. But it seems to me to be almost a reaction against a certain form of Protestantism and the Church of Christ. And it seems like many people in the Restoration movement, do they have like a view of like baptism, like regeneration, like baptismal regeneration? Yeah,
for sure. Which was interesting. I had not been baptized, yet they accepted me into a formation program where it was expected that I would preach that, you know, I would believe that and I would lead people to that.
Like
But
an
I had not,
unbaptized pastor, like talking about the
right.
the
So
importance of it. Yeah.
I was eventually baptized we were actually studying, you know, St. Paul's letters, and we were reading about, man, at this point, I don't even remember, but I was just like, I think I should do this. And they're like, wait, you were never, what do you mean you should do this? And I said, I'm not baptized. So one of my classmates who was a Church of Christ minister was like, we're going down to the fountain right now. And so that was
going
where
down.
that's where I was baptized, was in the fountain in the middle of the campus.
Wow. Oh, like in the middle of the campus fountain. Yeah. Cool. Did you go down 3 times?
Just once.
Yeah. No, but that's how deep was the fountain? Just kind of a shallow fountain?
there was a removable grate with steps down in because they anticipated this.
Oh,
So it
okay,
was
gotcha.
built as a baptismal.
They have 8 sides, like in
Uh,
the ancient churches. Like there's like these big like 8-sided.
yeah, no, it was
Around.
cruciform. It was in the shape of a cross, so it's you know
Yeah, baptized into Christ.
yeah
That's cool. Yeah, I mean, I grew up Southern Baptist, so we didn't think about baptism. It's funny, the word Baptist is in there, but we don't have that high of a view,
yeah
you know, of what's going on, like a Catholic or a Lutheran or Church of Christ person might have. But I remember when I started believing that, you read the fathers and when you dig into scripture, it's like, yeah, like baptism replaces circumcision. You get into covenant theology
yeah
and some cool discoveries. It's funny how like my journey to discovering apostolic Christianity, it's like you have the intense part before that, but there's all these like little layers you're adding on way before that. Do you feel like your journey was kind of like that?
yeah. Say that again.
Like layers, like where you're just adding almost kind of like one, let's say, Orthodox layer after another.
Mm,
That's kind of like leading you towards
yeah.
that. It's a messy process too. I'm not saying it's like this
Well, it's
perfect,
it's super interesting in retrospect. Like that period of time, like during graduate school, the two things that I think probably most set me up to end up where I did were one when we were kind of going through church history and historical theology, and we were reading like On the Holy Spirit by St. Basil, right? And I was like, what is this? Like, this is amazing, And they're like, oh, he, did some monastic stuff, but that's where it went off the rails. Like, we don't need monastics. And he was just some Catholic guy. And, that was all corrected later, more or less. And I was like, oh, but this is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And then I took a class called Spiritual Formation and Guidance, where would be very atypical for a Church of Christ school, but like our professor was leading us through all these Ignatian spiritual exercises and like I guess classically Jesuit spirituality, and had to do some silent retreats and had to do some like examination of conscience, like an examen prayer or imaging prayer, and like a lot of these things. Some of it kind of bordered on more of like a new agey thing when I look at it now, but that was deeply impactful to me. Like that caused me to go buy a book of common prayer first, get an Anglican book and start keeping like hours of the day. So between reading St. Basil and that class, like I had already had this liturgical orientation that I carried with me when I eventually landed in youth ministry in like a Pentecostal charismatic tradition.
Mm-hmm.
So
I'm interested. Did you read like the celebration of discipline by like
yeah,
Richard Foster, and then Dallas Willard has some books like Renovation of the Heart, and like there's a whole like spiritual formation program that like really became popular, and I experienced that too at Taylor University,
yeah,
and
yeah. The
I took that stuff into
Renovare.
youth ministry too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I would like it was a pretty quick transition from that. Like I actually finished school when we moved back to Pennsylvania, my wife and I did. And we were just looking for a church. I had no denominational loyalty at that point. It was like Nazarene to non-denominational to a Church of Christ school to let's just find a good church close to our community. And we landed in this charismatic church that was, we didn't realize how charismatic it was up front. Like it was by the time we were in it that we realized it, and we were already committed at that point. But yeah, I just started I started getting into trouble almost immediately because it was like we'd have youth group meetings and the kids would be sitting in silence for 20 minutes just listening, and then they would like journal about it, and they loved it. They're like, thank you. Like everybody's just always talking at me, or like I'm just bombarded all the time. Like nobody's ever asked me to just be quiet and like what's going on in my interior. And meanwhile, senior leadership's like, it's got to be hype. Like you got to be smashing cars with sledgehammers and nacho nights. And I'm like, could I teach them to pray? Like, could I teach them to listen and like discern what's going on in their heart and like sort through the good and the bad?
1980s youth ministry, just like just Mountain Dew spraying everywhere,
Right. Yeah.
more,
Look like
more
an
pizza, lock-ins. I grew up in that whole world, and yeah, when I was doing youth ministry, I was determined not to do it
yeah.
that way. We still had pizza, we still did those things, but it had to have depth.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, we did Stations of the Cross.
Oh wow,
Yeah,
yeah,
like we
that's
did,
bold right there. Yeah.
and we did a lot of stuff. But
So you're doing like silent, you're doing silent contemplative prayer. You're doing Stations of the Cross at a charismatic church. That's pretty unique. Like I haven't heard that before. I've heard
yeah,
dabbling in it, but not that intentional.
on our one annual youth retreat, I remember I bought the biggest icon of the Last Supper I could find, and I put that on a table, and I had a friend of mine make these wooden candle stands, and then I basically created Protestant Eucharistic adoration. So I bought just a big loaf of bread and a big chalice of juice, and I put those in front of the icon, and we woke all the kids up at 5 a.m. and their cat and trudge through the snow over to the main meeting area. They would come in, they would light a candle, and they would just sit down. And we sat in silence for an hour. And that was one of the more beautiful experiences where they're like, it was so real to me. Like,
Mm.
Christ giving himself to me in communion was so real. And it was like they experienced the real presence before it was actually the real presence.
Yeah, there's a real kind of preparation, I think, where
Yeah.
you have to go through a process of elevating your view and preparing spiritually for the original, apostolic understanding of the Eucharist. But I went through the same thing, man. Like I remember I went to a lock-in at a Lutheran church, and I didn't, I only had heard of Lutherans. I had never really had any real interaction. And their lock-in was quite different than the lock-ins I did as a Baptist, where I think like at midnight we enter the chapel and everything's pitch black, and it's the first time I've ever had wine. Like
Yeah.
they and I'm like I was not even expecting it because they didn't even tell me, and so I'm taking this sip and I'm like, whoa, I wasn't
Yeah.
as a Baptist boy not ready for that, and I'm like, you guys like think something deeper is going on here than what I've experienced growing up. And then the Methodists and through the Emmaus retreats
Mhm.
have a very intense kind of communion focus. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's normally an important step for most people.
Yeah. And it's
Yeah.
at a certain point I started, this jumps ahead a little bit, but I had started kind of liturgizing our youth groups on Wednesday nights. So it was like I started incorporating like processing in with a gospel book and like doing an epistle reading and a gospel reading. And we all prayed the Lord's Prayer together. And there'd be kind of responsive psalms. And then there'd be a sermon. And then there would be a time for prayer at the end. And we started having communion more frequently. And we started doing studies of like the Nicene Creed. And
Why were you evolved? Like, why were you just like doing this hyper development, that this liturgical direction? Was there like stuff? Were you just reading more and more things too that were feeding into that, or was this just spirit
yeah,
led, if you will?
well, clearly I was already on that trajectory. That was already a part of who I was. I was already in love with this kind of rooted in tradition expression of the faith, but I never had considered the idea that there was something there to enter into. At that point, it was always, these are things I can just retrieve and I can just take for myself.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I eventually kind of described that was I felt like I was in a baby pool trying to take buckets of water out of like the big pool and just fill my own pool. And I never thought like, why don't I just go get in that pool? But I started having some, visceral reactions to our worship services and in the charismatic tradition. And the big moments for me were one day I was playing guitar on a Sunday and I had the lyric sheet in front of me and I just started counting how many times did I say I or me or we or us, and it was like 30 sometimes or something like that. And how many times do we actually like sing to God or use his name in any form? And it was a third of that, 10.
Mm-hmm.
And like I just looked around the room and I thought we have really comfortable chairs and we have these really big TV screens and like everybody has their coffee and like the lobby has all this signage and these greeters and these things. And it's like the entirety of this is about us. And, lest I overreact, like looking back on that, I think like it's not that there's not an aspect of church that isn't about us, right?
Yeah, I was gonna have you like, what is good in the charismatic movement?
Yeah.
Like what is good about it? In the
Yeah.
evangelical, world too. There's kind of similar things going on when it comes to like the writing and the music world, right?
Yeah. And we can hit on that. But
Yeah, yeah.
in this area, it was like, okay, so I already had that going on. I had this leaning in one direction, and I had this dissatisfaction or this disillusionment in another. And then the weird linchpin moment was our lead pastor brought in a Messianic Jewish rabbi to teach about the festival of booths. And like they set up these tabernacles, like these tents in the sanctuary, and at the end of what was a really amazing message that I remember none of at this point. I just remember being very impressed by it. Like, oh wait, like there's a continuity here between like our Jewish roots and like our Christianity. Like, and at the end, the rabbi blessed the congregation chanting in Hebrew, and like everybody lit up. Like everybody in the lobby afterwards was like, oh, I wish we had a tradition. I wish I was Jewish, like all these things. And I thought, well, we have to have something. I mean, we've been around a while now. And like, I know I'm pulling bits and pieces from the past. So like, why don't I see, like, we talk a lot about, we got to get back to the book of Acts. So what did that look like? How did they worship? How did this? And a friend of mine who was our worship pastor also had some of the same leanings as I did. And one of his best friends was a retired priest in the OCA, Father Theo.
Okay.
So
what year is this, by the way? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I worked there from 2015 till 2020.
Okay.
So this was probably about 2018. And it was not uncommon in this Pentecostal church to have a retired Orthodox priest in a cassock sitting in the front row during our worship services, because he just loved Eric so much. Eric was our worship pastor.
Oh, wow.
So I had these really weird crossovers. I also at this point had sought out a spiritual director who is Father Boniface Hicks.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So he's been my spiritual director for like the last 8 years, like long before I ever even wanted to become anything other than Protestant. So I had all these influences, and I started studying, and just a friend of mine said, hey, what do you know about the Orthodox Church? And I said, I don't know anything about it other than Father Theo. And he said, well, my kids are on a soccer team. One of the dads goes to this place, Mount Athos, like every year. He's the most peaceful man I know. He never tries to convert me. It's kind of irritating me. And I was just curious. I said, well, let's get a book, ask him for a book, and let's read it. And we read Becoming Orthodox by Father Peter Gilchrist, and went to visit a monastery. And I just started falling in love with this expression, this Eastern expression, and just the Orthodox way of things. And that's when I started pulling more of that. And that's when I started doing kind of the liturgy thing, and my office at church started filling with icons, and I was burning incense when nobody was there, and I was making the sign of the cross in secret. And just little by little, it kind of took over.
Wow. You had this thing that was forming inside of you, and it's interesting to hear your journey, like add these layers to it, and God weaving people in and out of it. I wonder, like, okay, so was there a breaking point at some point where, like, there of course is going to be at some point a breaking point in you, but then also that comes out externally with like relationships, particularly when you work for a church. I mean, it just becomes obvious. Was there a breaking point? Yeah.
2020, I kind of got to this point where, we're doing these studies of the creed, and we start asking questions about baptism, and like baptism Sundays are coming up. And at this point, I believe baptism is a sacrament. It's a means of grace. It's an unrepeatable event. And, I have youth kids that are asking to be baptized, and I ask them, have you been baptized? And they'll say, well, my grandma is Lutheran, or my grandma was Catholic, and they had me baptized when I was a baby. And I told them I would not baptize them. And then the senior pastor is like, well, you have to. And I'm like, I'm not going to. And he's like, I also need you to quit teaching that communion is actually the body and blood of Jesus. Like, because yeah, so that starts getting me some hot
Yeah,
water.
so you were already teaching
Yeah.
like the real presence of the Eucharist in your
Which
yeah.
maybe was like poor form on my part. Like I should have known better. Like I shouldn't have pushed that, but at the same time, it's
I
I
mean,
believe
it's
it to be
messy,
true.
man. It's whole things, it's there's no guidebook. Well, people are writing them now, but I
Yeah.
didn't have one. And I mean, for instance, Chan is like literally doing the same thing right now with
Yeah.
like thousands and thousands of people that you were doing in
Yeah.
your church. So I mean, he's doing it on like a massive scale. We don't know like where that's going to end up, but again, there's no rule book because you don't even know where it's going to end up. We have no magic ball telling us how it's going to.
And I really had a sense, delusional or otherwise, I had read enough books about, people who had become Orthodox or become Catholic and their whole congregation kind of ended up doing this. Really, I was deluded to think like that was going to happen. I really thought this is so convincing that everybody's going to get it. They just hadn't been introduced to it.
Mm-hmm.
And, but it was like 2020, and COVID starts happening and, we start live streaming services and communion Sunday comes around and the slide comes up on the screen. That's, if you don't have crackers and juice at home, get creative, use cookies and milk.
Yeah.
And I thought, they're not going to come along with where I'm headed. That's for
Mm-hmm.
certain. And it was strongly suggested to me that I resign. So I did so. I resigned. I resigned the week before all the COVID lockdowns.
Mm.
Um, and then they were like, you know what? Take 6 months. We will pay you,
Wow.
but do not come to work. And it was very generous, honestly. It really was. Um, so I took that time we lived in a rectory, a parsonage. So I took that time to find a house, took that time to try to find a job. We had a baby in that time. It was insane. But
Mm-hmm.
that was the aforementioned breaking point.
Oh, sure. We were pregnant with our first kid when I was going through my whole resignation and going through the wild ride of entering into Catholic Christianity and it can be a wild ride. What a generous gift though to have 6 months paid. Yeah, that's like,
Yeah.
hey, go on sabbatical for like 6 months.
Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
that's God's grace and His provision there for sure. So then you're out of a job, you're homeless, but you're well provided for. And then at this point, are you thinking like, okay, I'm gonna go Orthodox, or were you thinking Anglican or Catholic or something like that, Lutheran?
Yeah, I was at that point, I was sold on Orthodoxy.
Okay.
But a wrench came into that. I was, maybe it was a little before that resignation point. So yeah, it was before that the wrench entered, where I still to this day can't figure out how it happened. But I just Googled. It had been a while since I was able to make it to a Vespers or a liturgy. Like for a while, I was sort of like Nicodemus. I was sneaking off and like going to whatever liturgical service I could. And I just couldn't for a while. So I had Googled Eastern Church near me. Like I didn't use the word Orthodox, and this Ukrainian Catholic church popped up. And this was before I would have seen that interview with Father Michael O'Loughlin that I talked about that got me connected to Pints and Matt. But a Ukrainian Catholic church, and I'm like, what is that? So I'm looking at their website. I'm like, this looks kind of like an Orthodox church, but it kind of doesn't look like an Orthodox church. And everything I'm reading on there, they're like quoting all these saints that I knew to be, to my understanding, Orthodox. And they're talking about the Jesus prayer, and the priest looks like he's wearing the same vestments as an Orthodox church. And it says they have a liturgy on Tuesdays at noon. And I was like, well, that's strange. So I'm going to reach out to him. So I sent an email and like immediately get a response from Father Jason Sharon
Mm-hmm.
at Holy Trinity. And he was like, yes, we have liturgy. Please come join us. Also, I hope this isn't too forward, but if you're free tonight, come to my house for cigars and steak. And I was like, I would love to. I couldn't. I didn't make it to that. But I went. I visited this Tuesday liturgy and was just blown away by the people and his responses to my questions. I
Mm.
was just really grilling him on like the papacy, the filioque. What do you do about this? The Immaculate Conception, and he had a good answer to all of them. And that kind of opened up this door of like, okay, before I go all the way into this, I need to study that, you know? And at that point, my wife was not interested at all. You know, I was also like very aggressive about it at that time.
Mm.
You know, I was like, this is what we're doing. This is it. This is the truth. And she's like, I don't need anything else. And like, honestly, she really didn't. Like, she's much more a faithful Christian than I probably will ever be. And like has a stronger prayer life than I probably ever will have. And a love for the scripture and an intuitive grasp of the scripture in a way that I never will have.
Mm.
But she was interested in the community that I had found in this Eastern Catholic church and other Eastern Catholic churches that I had visited. That was not the same as what I was experiencing in Eastern Orthodox churches. So that kind of like led us on this side quest as we investigated that, which I had become a catechumen in the Orthodox Church. At one point, I left the catechumenate to go, you know, just attend an Eastern Catholic church for a year, and then eventually got freaked out by the Immaculate Conception and the papacy, and left that, went back to the catechumenate, and then was received into the Orthodox Church, but have always maintained this deep, deep love for Catholicism, and specifically Eastern Catholics, having been as suppressed or oppressed or mistreated. They've been explained to me as martyrs who climb up out of the trenches and get shot at by both sides, which I think is a pretty fair and apt description.
Perfect climate for holiness.
Yeah,
just
it really
constant suffering. Yeah, I mean, the Church of the Martyrs, if it's just like a continual, you know, you're just getting continual blasted and the martyrs just being made constantly. I mean, holiness is going to be there, you know?
Yeah. So that's kind of what brought up the detour, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. Like, again, like those who are listening, because, I've got a lot of people who are Catholic and Orthodox, but also Protestant, and they're interested in this journey. Like, what would it be like? Am I going to be like wandering around the desert for years until I find a home? That can be a difficult thing to swallow when you think of it like that. But what I would say to people is, get to know the fathers, get to know the ancient church, pray a ton, and then make your decision. Because if you just stall it for years and years and years, you're never actually going to be able to also feel it out inside, like how can you explain what life is like without like sacramental confession and the Eucharist and all, the whole sacramental life.
Yeah. And the thing that's occurred to me is like, if the actual Catholic and Orthodox churches have not been able to figure this out for full reunion in how long now? 1,000 years or something.
Mm-hmm.
What makes you think you as an individual with way less holiness and way less intelligence is going to figure it out yourself?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, okay, I can read this book and that book and this book. I could spend the rest of my life reading these books, but there's plenty of saints in my communion who affirm the papacy as we see it. There's been Catholic writers who have rejected the Immaculate Conception. There's been, it's messy. Like, it's just,
right.
It's not clean. It's not clean cut. And, everybody has their fix of an answer. Like, one person told me, like, hey, why don't you just go back and read the minutes from the ecumenical councils, the first 7 councils? And I'm like, you know what? That's a good idea. Like, if the papacy's in there and I affirm those councils, like, I'm obligated to do something about that. That led me on a whole nother detour as I get to like the 4th council and I start studying the Oriental Orthodox churches. And I'm like, wow, there's really something there.
Mm-hmm.
And like, all these communions are producing saints. And
yeah, it's like there's not just Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox. I mean, there is like a whole another world of apostolic churches out there that the West doesn't think much about. They're becoming, of course, because of YouTube and social media, people are becoming aware of them. But like 10 years ago, I mean, like, what's the Assyrian Church of the East? Like, what is that? I discovered that back in 2009. I read a book by Philip Jenkins on the golden age of Christianity for like the first 1,000 years. And he, like, half the book is about the Assyrian Church of the East, Patriarch Timothy, and it basically was like a third of the church.
Yeah.
Like if you go back, 1,200 years ago in the 800s, I mean, the Persian church, like that stretched from like Antioch through Iraq all the way to India, is like this massive missionary church going all the way to China. And it's like,
Wow.
I kind of fell in love just studying it. And this was way before I thought about becoming like not being Protestant anymore. So it's funny. The Assyrian Church of the East was like my introduction into the apostolic churches. So I kind of nerd out on it a little bit. I need to have some
That's
guests.
so
from
interesting
there.
because I've not really spent much time with that.
Yeah. They're called Nestorians, but they
Right.
get slandered, I'm going to get in trouble for saying this.
Just like the whole Monophysite thing.
We have slurs like the apostolic churches. We have so much in common. Like there's a certain way of looking at it where we just have so much in common. It's like feels like the same thing in many ways, but because of our rocky histories, it's like there's all sorts of language that we use for one another. And thankfully today, I think when we ask, Father Robert Taft was a big scholar who listened a lot. He's like, if you ask the right questions instead of the wrong questions, you might actually find the answers that you're looking for when it comes to like the Christological questions or things like that. So, but those things haven't been solved. It's not easy.
And it's interesting, like even beyond just asking the right questions, like asking the right people, like I wanted to know, what do the Copts think about Christology? So like I visited a Coptic parish and met with that priest, and I said, tell me about this. And he gave me St. Cyril of Alexandria's On the Unity of Christ. And I'm like, St. Cyril, it's one of our saints. Like, he's like, is he considered, is he one of the pillars of Orthodoxy? Or is that's St. John Chrysostom, St. Gregory, and St.
Yeah, he's not, but he's deeply revered by Catholics,
Eastern
Orthodox, and Coptics, obviously, and so they go with him when the Fifth Council starts. Yeah.
So I'm like, wow, yeah. Actually, when I read this, like this lines up what I feel like I kind of read in the scripture, and like this actually like intuitively is kind of how I've always maybe understood the whole human divine nature thing. And I was like, okay, that's really interesting. And then I was like, well, tell me about how you pray. Like, if you really want to learn, like, you just need to pray the prayers, right? So he's like, we use this book, the Agpeya, grab it. And I grabbed it, and it's like all Psalms. And it's so simple, like, as opposed to like this Orthodox prayer book with 18 ribbons and like, okay, you have the Apollytikion and you have this hymn of the day and you got this movable part and like this tone. And that's like, the Agpeya is just, you pray the Psalms and these prayers, and it's straightforward every day, and it's super simple. I'm like, okay, I love that, because everybody always says that the prayers of the early church were the Psalms, and
yeah, that's
there
true.
you go. And there's like this kind of less, I don't want to say less developed, there's this primitive of the people beauty of the liturgy that's doesn't have the fingerprints of the empire on it. There's not all of this kind of like lockstep choreography, in this door, out that door, bow very particularly. Like when you enter the church, you have to cross yourself 3 times before every icon and then venerate it and do this sort of thing. And it's like, no, like they were too concerned with having their heads chopped off to develop all this stuff. They just show up and pray with their hands outstretched, and they trust God for everything he gives them and everything he takes away from them. And I'm like you said, that where the martyrs are, the holiness is. And,
yeah, it almost sounds like a little charismatic, man.
And it does. and it does. Yeah. And it's like, I wondered if this was almost a cop out in a way, as I sort of like found myself kind of connecting more with that tradition. But it was like some of the things that I had to overcome from Protestantism to Eastern Orthodoxy, I would not have had to overcome from Protestantism to Oriental Orthodoxy. Like, at least in the Coptic Church, I can't speak for the other 5, but things like the veneration of icons is just different. They're there, but it's just different. Or, we have all these akathist hymns and things like that, written to the different saints and even to icons and things like that. Like, they don't have any of that in the Coptic Church, but they have the saints and they have the relics and they have commemorations and really beautiful expressions surrounding that. So yeah, it's like there's something to fall in love with in all these different streams. And what would it look like if all the streams ran directly?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we can at least say bare minimum, all these streams are a part of the church.
Yeah.
You know, the different groups are going to kind of disagree on like the canonical boundaries or how all that works. But like I argue all the time that like you can't just listen to the Latin theological heritage or
Yeah.
just the Greek theological heritage. Like you also have to listen to the Syriac theological heritage. And I almost sometimes call it like breathing with like three lungs.
Yeah.
But then the Syriac has like like a Western and an Eastern version that they're actually quite different. And so it's many of these rivers that run through like the real church. And I found that I just fall in love with all of it.
Yeah.
So it's
I just want it
awesome,
all.
but it causes problems too.
You know, it was interesting too, like having that run into the Coptic tradition was kind of one of the things that made me think more and more about the stuff that separates Eastern Orthodoxy from Roman Catholicism are very much manufactured.
Mm-hmm.
Because in like pop Orthodox apologetics, it's a lot of, well, they use unleavened bread. And it's like, okay, well, the Armenians have never used leavened bread. And you can't say that like they've changed. And that was not a problem for 450 plus years. That wasn't the thing. Or it was like, if you've ever listened to Father Hopko, a blessed memory, he had a series of what would the Catholic Church have to do to be reunified with the Orthodox Church, and he dismantled it all the way down to they need to make the sign of the cross the other way.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, well, the Copts have always made it left to right, not right to left, and that wasn't a problem. So like that's a false issue.
Yeah, I think I think you're doing the right thing where you have to look at all of the apostolic churches. And I think when you have something that's like in common among all of them, I don't think you should change that.
Yeah.
But then where there is some diversity, there has to be a lot more patience and study and say this, hey, this might be like a legitimate diversity in apostolic tradition, you know?
Yeah. And as I continue to like fanboy over the Oriental Orthodox churches now, like the diversity within their communion, you know, the Coptic church versus the Ethiopian church, a little more similar, but then you get to the Armenian church or you get to the Malankara church, it looks nothing like it. And it's like they have no problem with that diversity, and there's still a pretty profound unity there.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. The Oriental Orthodox do have quite a bit of diversity in their communion.
Yeah.
Sometimes the Catholics talk like they're the only ones that do. Like, oh, we have, you know, all these rights, but it's like if the Eastern Orthodox, not so much. It's primarily
Right.
Byzantine with a little bit of the Western Rite, but yeah, when you look at Coptic early Orientals, yeah, the Coptics are in communion with the Armenians and the Syro-Malabar Church, and that's quite diverse. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, these are things that like the apostolic churches talk a lot about. If you're a Protestant looking in, it kind of freaks you out when you start talking about these differences because you're like, that sounds so petty.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, but there's petty things within that
for
too,
sure.
you know?
Exactly. And so my thing is like, well, I guess if like literally every church had leavened bread and then one changed it, okay, then I could see a talking point there. Like if it's one way that we are held together, like if you can you can actually look at it ecumenically. It's better not to change to keep us all on the same page rather than change to get us dislodged. So there's these different ways to look at it. But if we start with charity, then I think it's going to go a lot better. Yeah. So you did become Eastern Orthodox. You went through the catechumen. What year did you join?
2022. So it was the Sunday of the prodigal son. I was chrismated, received into the Orthodox Church.
Awesome. And how has that been? Like living the liturgical life, the like participating in the sacraments.
It's a
how's
whole
that blessed
different
you?
game. It's a whole different game on the inside. You know, I really had this notion leading up to it of like, I'm already Orthodox, you know, like I'm keeping the prayer rule. I'm keeping the fasts. It was very prideful of me. But then once I started, especially having the ability to go to confession, Pairing that with communion, it was like, oh wow, I have a lot of work to do. So you kind of burn out a little quickly, especially if you're like trying to keep everything to a T, and you're like, I just can't do it. That's why you need the guidance of a spiritual father to say, like, this is what you're capable of. And really good spiritual fathers, I've even heard of Orthodox priests say, like, part of my catechumenate formation for my catechumens is telling them not to fast during this fasting period, lest they become prideful about it, and which I thought was great. My priest didn't do that, but I've heard other priests do that.
I think
so. Yeah,
people do get a little skittish about the fasting. But it's interesting that if you gotta take it straight to the heart. Like, it's not the external, but the external, like, we have bodies,
right?
Like so there is this thing about fasting that does help you detach from the things we're like obsessed with in maintaining our comfort. Like, particularly as Americans, we're just like, we live as kings and we eat meat like kings. In Orthodoxy, I found, like, the Eastern tradition, because I do the Eastern Catholic fast, and it's like, it's like, it is both a challenge. Like, it helps bring me down. Like, yeah, man, I do fall short. I see like what I love that's not good. And then it can also be a source of pride. So,
well, I think about, like, Saint Seraphim is my patron saint. It says fasting. Fasting, vigils, all of these things are but a means to an end. Like, the goal of it is acquisition of the Holy Spirit. And so I think a lot of converts in their zeal make the externals the thing and forget that, like, these things are made as tools for us. And it's sad because you can see a lot of people that fall into despair because they can't keep it all. And so I've had my own struggles with that. I've even had my own struggles of finding the right community. The parish where I was received was like 40 minutes from my house, and I was the only one in my family that entered the church. So, if I went and my wife and children didn't go with me, and I wanted to stay for coffee hour, or it was like a feast day, all of a sudden that becomes 4 or 5 hours on a Sunday away from my family. Well, that's not healthy. And so, trying to figure that out, ended up landing in a Serbian parish that's 3 minutes from my house. So then we had the adjustment to a liturgy that wasn't in English and a different calendar. So that was a bit jarring. So yeah, it's been an interesting ride for sure. But slowly it's been fun to watch my wife kind of learn to love the liturgy and connect with it on her own terms and in her own way, and then sort of sort through things very slowly, whereas I sorted through them very quickly. And like, we just had a conversation the other night where she's like, I'm really trying to find what Mary's role is in all of this. And she goes, I've never thought about her as much as I do now. And she's like, she's my girl. I was like, okay, well, she's my mom. So
that's great. It's great. I see this in couples and in families where, like, somebody can go through these changes really fast, and the other person takes a decade, or it never happens. And so there is the scary part of, like, living in that. But I think my advice to people is always, like, the whole goal again is, like, it is to acquire the Holy Spirit. And so if you you need to be patient, you need to be loving, not overly pushy. But if this is going to take you deeper and the Holy Spirit's leading you there, I do think it's going to be something that's going to have a lot of fruit. But
I've definitely grown in ways that I never imagined. And it's been through things not happening the way that I wanted them to. Like, I probably need to spend more time on my prayer thanking God for not giving me what I've asked him. Because it's worked out. It's worked out a lot better. But the questions that I had, even leading into my chrismation, when I was still like, I'm not certain about the papacy and the Catholic Church, and those questions never went away. I've continued to dig and search and read, and just keep finding that the more I try to find an answer, the more I find that I'm not going to get a straightforward answer. It's kind of what you were saying, where you can only read so much, you have to pray at least twice as much. And at a certain point, you just have to make a decision and work out your salvation with fear and trembling. And, anybody who is telling you like, I am convinced, or I'm 100% certain that this is the fullness of the truth and nothing else is, I think is fooling themselves, or hasn't read enough.
Yeah. And, I was there. Like when I first became Catholic, there was a lot more of this kind of, I tried to be open-minded, but there was this kind of like, when you're a Protestant, you love evangelization, like you love sharing your faith, and you discover this gold mine and you're so excited to tell people about it that, that you can get into that sort of thinking that like, there's this deep, I sometimes I think about this line and I didn't have this when I became Catholic, but like, when when the evangelist comes to town in the Protestant world, and they're like, if you have a shadow of a doubt, if you just have like an inkling that you're not saved, then you need to come up here tonight. It's like, ooh, I don't know if I ever have that type of certainty, where I'm 99.999, percent sure. But I think we have to be a lot more humble about what we can know, for sure.
Yeah. Which even with that example, which is why so many of my evangelical friends have gotten saved so many times, and it's like, yeah, I'm doing the same thing too. Like I'm continuously being saved.
Yeah. I joke with some of my Baptist friends who I grew up with, where I was like we taught like, once saved, always saved, eternally secure. But I got baptized a couple times.
Right.
I doubted my salvation quite a bit because they're like, how do you know it was the real thing? Like, how do you know that was the real thing? And because it's kind of emotional based, like the criteria, or you're just growing and becoming a teenager and doubting everything. It doesn't make you feel very secure, is what I'm saying. And what I found cool about living in a sacramental tradition is like, number one, there's objective criteria. Like, yes, I love the Lord. I have given him my allegiance. I've been baptized into him, and I go to confession. And there's like this, some objective criteria, at least, to say, I feel like, I'm there, but never there, but till we step into glory.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, man. Well, thanks for coming on the Barrel Age Faith. It's been fun to get to know you, and look forward to getting to know you a lot more in your journey. But you've been a blessing to, I know already, like a lot of people when they're kind of peeking they're opening the door, kind of peeking in, and they're wondering what are these apostolic churches, what are they all about? So your journey's helping them.
Well, I appreciate it, and I pray that really is the case. I'm trying to be more authentic to my experience in the journey and just be honest about it, because I think a lot of people have been afraid to be honest about it because they think like, oh man, I'm not as convinced as everybody else around me. That means something's wrong with my faith. And it's like, no, it means you're doing it right. And so I appreciate you inviting me and being my friend. Like, it's cool. I was thinking about it, after that initial meeting in Steubenville, we've texted a bit. You've written some articles for our locals page. But we haven't really got to unpack a lot of these things together. So this was fun.
Yeah, a lot of fun. I didn't even kind of realize that until tonight. Like, I feel like I know him, and we've like talked quite a bit now, but like we haven't really like talked like in person a lot, So
yeah,
and we're still not even technically in person.
Right.
Yeah,
we'll fix it.
I'm going to Steubenville for the Tolkien conference, but I might run into you when I'm in your area. Maybe I'll try to drive over there or something. But that's in September. Gonna hang out with all the hobbits at Franciscan University.
It's awesome.
All the Hobbit nerds, really, because it's not even a festival; it's a conference. So I'm going to listen to like boring papers.
Yeah, but you're going to love every second.
I know, like it's not going to be boring at all. It's going to be a thrill. I love it. Yeah, I love it. Actually, Lord of the Rings was my introduction into sacramental life. I mean, I was obsessed with the books and the movies in high school, and to me they felt like Christianity, like a type of sacramental reality where there's more than spirit, somehow providence and the divine are in the water and they're guiding this story, and they don't even really mention it a whole lot. It's kind of the unseen world.
Yeah.
And you fall in love with all these characters who look kind of like saints. Our Lady's in there, and so you just kind of see that, and that was way before I really had studied it academically.
Yeah.
So I get a little passionate about Lord of the Rings.
I love it. I could listen to it.
Yeah. Well, guys, thanks for joining in. Definitely subscribe to A Dose of Theosis on YouTube. Definitely check him out. Follow him on Locals. All the content that he's putting out, it's awesome. Don't forget to subscribe to this video, like it, share it. Helps get the word out, helps support the Barrel Age faith, so we can share more stories like this. All right. God bless. Have a great day, guys. We'll see you later. Bye-bye.